Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne, beginning this time with a look at a particularly intriguing boss drop. Stone of Yharnam, a holy relic left behind by Yharnam, Queen of Pthumeru. Now, with the Queen fallen, that appalling consciousness sleeps. However, that is merely sleeping, and no more. It's just a short description, and the item itself has no functional use in the game, but it still leaves us with a lot to consider in terms of its translation. For one thing, right in the title we get a potential play on words in the Japanese that simply doesn't work in English. Remember how one of the terms for intention or will in Japanese is pronounced Ishi? Well, this particular kanji for stone is read Ishi as well. That means there's a sense in which we could understand this item name as referring to Yharnam's will, something that nicely coincides with the information we get in the description about it containing her slumbering consciousness. Furthermore, as you may recall from previous episodes, there are other potential double meanings that could also be at work here, since Ishi is also the pronunciation for the dying wishes that inhere within blood, as well as the unusual term used for orphan in the Orphan of Kaz boss name. Put these various meanings for the phonetic Ishi together, and it's possible to come away with an understanding of this item as a stone that represents Yharnam's will, her orphan child, and her desires that continue to echo out into the present all at once. That might seem like a lot to read into an item name, but when you consider how one popular interpretation of the lore for this item hinges on its visual depiction resembling a lithopedion, or stone baby, suddenly, these ties to an orphan child meant to serve as a biological extension of Queen Yharnam's will beyond her death start to sound more relevant. After all, if we take this to be the petrified body of the Queen's child, and we consider the Orphan of Kaz to be a lingering aspect of Kaz's will based on the potential wordplay in its boss name, that seems to imply that this stone baby could potentially have fulfilled the same role for Yharnam. The thing is, that understanding depends entirely on interpretation. It's also possible these connections mean nothing, and much like we saw with the Orphan of Kaz nameplate, this creates a distinct problem for any sort of translation. After all, the one definite meaning based on the kanji, stone in this case, can't just be ignored in favor of its potential associations. That makes this another instance where I feel like reducing the possibility space from the Japanese version was unavoidable. Thankfully, such constrained choices are few and far between, and if we turn to the description, there are a couple points where I actually find the English writing clearer than the Japanese. That's because in the original, there are some references that require interpretive work that the translators have simply taken care of for English-speaking players. For instance, consider the phrase sono ozomashi ishiki. Literally, that works out to something like that appalling consciousness, but the English word that is actually misleading here. To see what's going on, you have to consider the word's function as a reference to a thing that's been mentioned before. Viewed in that light, when we look back, we can see that the correct referent in this case is the term Jo'o, or queen, meaning that this phrase is meant to indicate the appalling consciousness of the queen. This is exactly the same meaning we can observe in the official, her horrific consciousness, which also includes a referential word in English that harkens back to the same referent. Furthermore, by making this phrase the subject of the short sentence, her horrific consciousness is only asleep, the translators have also made it clear that this whole idea of her horrific consciousness is what the Japanese phrasing is referring to in the next line, which I've literally translated as, however, that is merely sleeping and no more. It's another instance where, thanks to the term sore, or that, a Japanese speaker needs to figure out what exactly is merely sleeping, whereas English-speaking players don't need to think twice. Much as I admire this clarity of reference in the official translation, though, the final part of the English line confuses me. That's because, as you may have noticed when I was providing my translation comparison, there's nothing in the Japanese about the Queen's horrific consciousness stirring in unsettling motions. Instead, all we get is a strong emphasis on the idea that it's merely asleep. And when I say it's a strong emphasis, I mean it. Not only do we have the term tada, which can mean only, modifying nemutteiru, which indicates a state of ongoing sleep, but it's then followed by the word dake to show that her consciousness is just asleep, and the formulation nisuginai, which emphasizes that said consciousness is no more than asleep. What I take from this is that in contrast to the penultimate Japanese line's assurance that the Queen's consciousness is asleep now that she's been defeated, The final line seeks to leave us unsettled by stressing how her consciousness is only asleep, not dead or gone. That's enough to get me to wonder if perhaps the official translation put in that part about the queen's consciousness stirring to get across the idea that it could awake at any time. Even so, it feels like an odd choice to me, since I'm not sure how a consciousness can be seen stirring in unsettling motions. Perhaps this is another instance of the translation reflecting now updated Japanese text. Admittedly, we can't know if that's true, but this item is so mysterious it invites speculation as to whether it was once intended to play a different role in the story. Much like this next one. Ring of Matrimony. The inhuman something or others called higher rank ones. A ring of matrimony they charged with a special meaning. In the old age of higher rank ones, matrimony was a blood covenant, and was only granted to those who embrace or would embrace a special baby or babies. Okay, I realized the final part of my literal reading was confusing and hard to follow, so before I go any further, I want to explain what's going on there. It's actually the result of a few aspects of the Japanese language that I've discussed before. Probably the most frequently occurring of these linguistic features is how nouns, in and of themselves, can be either singular or plural, so the word akago can refer either to one baby or multiple babies. But those of you with a sharp memory or an understanding of Japanese may recall that one of the other differences in how the language handles nouns is that there are no grammatical articles. So why did I mention a special baby in the singular and not a or the special baby? Well, admittedly, the answer involves some interpretation, but it's because the term akago is part of a phrase in the Japanese that modifies a noun which gets explicitly pluralized. If we break it down, we can see that the phrase in question, tokubetsu na akago o daku, is modifying mono, one of the terms for a person or being, that has also been given the pluralizing suffix tachi. That means we know there are multiple people or beings doing the embracing, which to me implies that there isn't one specific child being referred to, as the use of the in English would specify. I'm less certain whether this phrase refers to several individuals each embracing one special child, or several individuals each embracing multiple special children. But even here, I think it's most likely that only a single child for each person is involved. Still, I feel it's important to recognize that the Japanese is technically unclear on this. Of course, it's not just plurals and articles that Japanese can leave ambiguous. Another relevant aspect of the language is that it does not by default differentiate between present and future tense. In other words, the phrase tokubetsu na akago o daku mono tachi could refer either to those currently embracing a special child or to those who will embrace a special child in the future. That's important to note, because while it's often assumed that the present tense is the applicable one, the idea of those slated to bear a special child from the official translation works with the Japanese as well. So now that we've untangled that knot of grammatical possibilities, let's take a step back and consider what might be going on with the lore. Here we're going to engage with yet another aspect of this same phrase, because the idea of holding a child or children has deep connections to other key parts of Bloodborne. The Japanese text on the blood dreg, for instance, tells us that the dearest wish of the Vile Blood clan is to hold a child of blood in those arms, and a handful of other Cainhurst-related items refer to this as well. Intriguingly though, it's also possible to link Queen Yharnam with this idea through the text of the Blood Rapture rune. Here, there are two things to consider. First, the rune is a guaranteed drop from the shadows of Yharnam, who as we now know could be considered servants of Queen Yharnam. Second, note how the official translation points out this rune resonates with servants of the Queen, who is then identified as the carrier of the child of blood. This descriptor is the same in Japanese, with the phrase chi no akago o daku, which I'd normally interpret as embrace a child of blood, directly modifying the term jo, meaning queen. Crucially, if we interpret this as a reference to a queen who currently embraces a child of blood, then that would seem to rule out Annalise, since while she's the queen of the Vile Bloods, it doesn't sound like she's achieved her own wish for holding such a child. So Blood Rapture could be seen as a rune dropped specifically by the servants of Queen Yharnam, Blood Queen and carrier of the child of blood. Since we know she's from the distant past, that makes it sound like she was a recipient of a Ring of Betrothal, with her special child representing her eligibility to enter into the blood contract of wedlock. It would also tie her in some way to the Great Ones, since we know they gave the ring a special meaning. However, there's a reason I've been treating all this as speculative. You see, thanks to that non-past aspect of the language I mentioned earlier, there's some potential ambiguity in the Japanese. That phrase on the Blood Rapture rune could be referencing a queen who will embrace a child of blood, and thus not rule out Annalise after all. For my part, I see this as unlikely, since Japanese often specifies when the future version of the non-past form is intended, but there does remain an element of uncertainty here. Still more ambiguous, though, are the specifics of the final connection we can make to this idea of holding a child. Remember how we found that note in Bergenworth about the red moon? It ends with the phrase, "Warera akago o dakan," which could be understood as, surely we will embrace a child. I've mentioned before how open to interpretation this phrase is, as well as my uncertainty as to why the official translation associates the verb daku, or iraku, with childbirth. Focusing purely on the Japanese, though, it does seem to imply some connection between holding a special child, the red moon, a blood contract involving the Great Ones, matrimony, and blood queens. It all feels like it's tied together somehow, even if the specifics remain elusive and open to interpretation. As we ponder those connections, though, I want to switch over to a different character for a look at another piece in this complicated puzzle. We're going to travel to the Blood Queen's chamber for a dialogue with Annalise you can only hear after first becoming a Vile Blood and then entering Pthumeru Ihyll. You'll note that she seems particularly pleased to see us on this occasion.
Closest of kin, last of our kind, I welcome thee. What is thy wish?
Nothing special, really. Just thought I should check in.
We await thy return. This chamber was made not for one alone. For the honor of Cainhurst.
That sounds like she may be considering us for a companion, and by switching back to my main character, we can see what happens if, in exploring the Root Chalice dungeons of Pthumeru Ihyll, you find the Ring of Betrothal and think to offer it to a modern Blood Queen seeking to bear a special child.
Closest of kin, bearer of our blood, I welcome thee. What is thy wish?
I wish for your hand in marriage.
Speak not those words. We have little need of a consort. Such a path would belike lead to further ruin. Thou art dear to us. We would see no harm befall thee.
Oh, but I insist.
Still thy honeyed tongue. The thought alone sufficeth. Thy worth is too great. Now, speak no more on the matter.
I'll speak on it if I want.
Honestly.
And that's it. Annalise will never accept the Ring of Betrothal, even though she has a dialogue that seems primed to get us to search for it, which only unlocks right when it becomes possible to begin that search. Not to mention all the other dialogues we can access thanks to a new menu option after we've found the ring. That level of possibility, which leads only to a single predetermined outcome, is one of the biggest reasons people have long suspected there may have been more plans for the Ring of Betrothal than the developers could ultimately realize. Even as this interaction stands, though, Annalise's intimation of an unpleasant future should we become her spouse is an intriguing addition to the lore we've been trying to puzzle through. As such, I think it's worth going into some detail concerning the translation of those lines, because there are a few points where my literal version can be misleading. First of all, you may have noticed that the official translation includes a strong statement of denial at the start of the second line, whereas my literal version appears to be more about the current situation being preferable. This is potentially confusing, because much like how in English we might casually turn down something offered to us by saying, "No thanks, I'm good," the Japanese phrase that opens the second line could be interpreted as Annalise saying that because she is currently doing just fine, she doesn't really need a consort. As for the second part of the Japanese line, and the entire following one, here the official translators have done an amazing job of consolidating everything into a single short sentence. The Japanese subtitles have Annalise spelling out that if we become her companion, the result would likely be a horrible future. Meanwhile, the official translation condenses the idea by referencing such a path, which is clearly meant to indicate the path on which she and the player character become betrothed, and then extending that metaphor by speaking of where that path leads, which would be further ruin. Actually, I'd say this approach even has an advantage over the Japanese, because by speaking of further ruin, the English phrasing hints at the tragedy that's already befallen Cainhurst. It also serves as an oblique reminder that Annalise was the sole survivor of that previous massacre, which is further emphasized when she says at the end that she would see no harm befall thee. To be fair, the Japanese ends up hinting at these same ideas, only it happens in a different order, meaning that thankfully, the writers handled these things much more adeptly than me fumbling with the PS5 controller. Anyway, in Japanese, the idea that it's the player character who would likely suffer from getting engaged to Annalise is more strongly present in the second and third lines of dialogue, with the reference to the previous tragedy coming in the final line about not wanting to experience further loss. This is also another point where my literal version is perhaps misleading, because I've brought forward an implied subject that makes it seem like the line is exclusively about losing the player character. In the original, however, it's possible to read this as also hinting that Annalise simply doesn't want to experience any further loss, which calls to mind the Executioner raid. All things considered then, I'd say these highly lore-relevant lines have been handled exceptionally well in translation, and that's not even considering the intentional archaisms and royal features of Annalise's speech. With that in mind, though, I want to return to the idea from the preceding analysis of it being the player character who's most likely to suffer from a marriage with Annalise. Why might that be the case? Well, it could be for fairly innocuous reasons. Maybe Annalise is simply traumatized by what happened in the past. Maybe she believes her immortality will either let her survive another murderous attack or guarantee her outliving us. Or maybe she could have some insight into her unique position should she become the mother of a child of blood. Perhaps on a night of the red moon, the Great Ones would descend and see that special child as one owed to them by a blood contract symbolized by the Ring of Betrothal, with potentially dire consequences for queen and consort. Or perhaps not. It's entirely unclear how much Annalise would know about ancient Pthumerian marriage practices to begin with, not to mention all the ambiguity I've already mentioned surrounding the specifics tying the Ring of Betrothal, the Blood Queens, and that note from Byrgenwerth together. Still, it's a compelling set of connections to speculate about, with potentially huge implications when it comes to understanding the lore. But this series does not consist of lore alone, so now that I've outlined what I think are the most salient points in that regard, I'd like to close out the episode by highlighting my favorite translation choice from this whole sequence of dialogues. There's actually some stiff competition here, because the whole exchange is handled so well, but short as it is, I think it's the final brief set of lines that most impresses me. To see why, let's first take a look at what's happening in the Japanese. We already know from the preceding dialogues that while Annalise appreciates our marriage proposal and cares for us, she has no intention of accepting and has made that clear. So when we ask one more time, she gives us an extended version of the laugh she responded with before, followed by a short phrase letting us know that our persistence is getting annoying. Her earlier laugh softens the meaning, as does the earlier context, but it's clear she's running out of things to say and wants us to stop. All of this is thus perfectly captured by her reaction of, "honestly," in English. It conveys her exasperation, yet gives her space to remain somewhat flattered and taken aback. It also fits the situation, and clearly signals that the conversation is over, which is relevant since this is the final variation we get of her response. What's more, it sounds completely natural in English, and manages to be even briefer than the Japanese. Oh, and consider how much this particular meaning depends on the vocal delivery, which means the translators at Frog Nation may have leveraged their position in being able to direct the voice actor to make this happen. Either way, that the translators managed to accomplish so much with such a short phrase deeply impresses me. And that, I believe, is a good point to go out on. In doing so, let me remind you that if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I'd love to hear them. Your feedback is always appreciated. Alternatively, if you want to hear my thoughts on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, check out the Translationborne Index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching, everyone.